As a 29-year-old lead architect in Chicago, Clara Hayes was organizing her final blueprints for the city's largest eco-complex when her mother-in-law, Eleanor, slammed a heavy legal folder onto her desk and seized the master drive. The rhythmic clicking of Eleanor's designer heels against the hardwood floor signaled the absolute end of Clara's professional career. There was no polite greeting. There was no family warmth. There was only the sharp, agonizing sound of a deadbolt engaging as the executive office doors sealed shut behind them. Eleanor slid a single, crisp sheet of paper across the mahogany surface. The document bore the heavy gold seal of the Vance real estate empire, the very company Clara had married into and spent the last 4 years saving from absolute bankruptcy. At the bottom of the page, a bold, irreversible stamp read the final verdict. "These patents do not belong to you anymore," Eleanor stated, her voice as cold and sharp as shattering champagne glass. The older woman adjusted her expensive silk scarf, her eyes completely devoid of any human empathy. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the freshly minted registration forms. Every structural innovation, every sustainable energy grid, every sleepless night Clara had poured into the harbor project was now legally registered under Eleanor Vance's personal holding company. Clara reached for the folder, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of the theft. She had drafted those initial blueprints in the cramped attic of her father's house long before she ever wore the heavy Vance wedding ring. But the corporate letterhead told a completely different story. The legal jargon explicitly categorized her life's work as a standard corporate asset, stripping her of all creation rights, future royalties, and professional credit. The immediate loss was absolute. She was erased from her own masterpiece in a matter of seconds. The power dynamics in the room were brutally clear. Eleanor controlled the board of directors, the ruthless legal team, and the limitless offshore accounts. Clara only had her raw talent and a massive mountain of high-interest student loan debt. When Clara married into the wealthy Vance family, she naively believed she was joining a partnership of equals. Instead, she had walked blindly into a highly sophisticated indentured servitude contract meticulously disguised as a marriage certificate. "You will not speak to the press, and you will absolutely not contact a lawyer," Eleanor continued, pacing slowly around the spacious office like a predator circling a wounded bird. She dropped a secondary, much thicker file next to the first one. This dark folder contained manipulated banking records, offshore wire transfers, and a flawlessly forged trail of internal emails. "If you attempt to leave this family or challenge this ownership transfer, our attorneys will file federal criminal charges against you for corporate espionage." Clara stared at the forged documents in total horror. The emails were crafted to look exactly as though she had been actively selling company secrets to a major rival firm in New York. It was a perfect, inescapable legal frame job. Eleanor had not just stolen her monumental work. She had built a razor-sharp guillotine directly over Clara's head. The nightmare escalated with brutal precision. Eleanor casually mentioned Clara's elderly father, a retired factory mechanic living in a modest house on the outskirts of the city. The Vance Corporation had quietly purchased his mortgage debt 2 months ago through a shell company. If Clara fought back, if she dared to step out of line, her father would be ruthlessly evicted within 48 hours, and Clara would be facing a 10-year federal prison sentence. The trap was flawlessly executed from every possible angle. She was caged by her own brilliance and her unconditional love for her only living relative. The heavy silence in the room grew suffocating. Clara looked at the grand windows overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline, the very skyline she was supposed to change forever with her visionary designs. The pristine glass reflected the image of a woman who had everything stolen from her in broad daylight. Her husband was conveniently out of the country on a luxury business trip, completely unreachable by phone or email. But Clara knew the sickening truth. He was entirely complicit. He had given his mother the administrative passwords to Clara's private servers late last night. The marital betrayal cut much deeper than the corporate theft. Eleanor pressed a silver button on her mahogany desk, summoning the armed private security guards waiting in the hallway. "Escort my daughter-in-law back to the main estate. She is feeling extremely unwell and will be taking an indefinite medical leave of absence from her architectural duties." The tall guards stepped into the room, their silent presence a looming, physical threat. Clara was no longer an esteemed employee or a cherished family member. She was a high-value hostage. True power in this modern world does not always manifest in physical violence. It often hides behind the elegant stroke of an expensive pen on premium paper, heavily cloaked in dense legal jargon and corporate seals. The most unbreakable chains are not forged from cold iron, but from debt, psychological manipulation, and the cruel weaponization of familial love. When society builds towering monuments to financial success, it rarely questions the crushed bones and stolen dreams buried deep within the concrete foundation. Clara walked out of that glass tower not as a defeated victim, but as a hyper-focused observer memorizing every single structural weakness in the empire she was about to burn to the ground. She stepped into the waiting black car, the cold leather seats feeling exactly like the interior of a coffin, but the fire behind her eyes was just beginning to spark. The heavy wrought iron gates of the Vance estate sealed shut, officially beginning Clara's high-end incarceration. The sprawling mansion situated in the affluent northern suburbs of Chicago was designed to resemble a classic European fortress. Today, that architectural choice felt suffocatingly literal. Two silent private security contractors escorted her through the expansive marble foyer, their heavy footsteps echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Every exit, every long hallway, and every heavy glass door was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance cameras. She was no longer a respected professional. She was a meticulously guarded prisoner trapped within thousands of square feet of imported luxury. Eleanor was already waiting in the main conservatory, sipping dark tea from a delicate porcelain cup. The older woman casually extended a hand, palm up, demanding absolute surrender. "Hand over your personal smartphone, your smartwatch, and your private laptop," Eleanor commanded, her tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Since you are under a highly sensitive internal corporate investigation for espionage, all of your personal communication devices must be seized and audited by our private tech team. We cannot risk any further leaks to the press or our market competitors." At that exact moment, Clara's phone began to vibrate violently in her coat pocket. The bright screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from her elderly father. He always called at this precise hour, right after finishing his afternoon shift at the local hardware store. Clara stared at the glowing device, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. If she answered, Eleanor would immediately view it as an act of defiance and trigger the aggressive foreclosure on his small house, making the most agonizing, controversial decision of her life. Clara swallowed her tears, silenced the ringing, and placed the phone directly into Eleanor's waiting hand. She willingly sacrificed her father's immediate peace of mind to secure his long-term physical survival, leaving him to worry in the dark. Eleanor smiled thinly, clearly satisfied by this ultimate display of utter defeat. "A very wise choice," the matriarch murmured, dropping the expensive devices into a thick black velvet security bag. "Your husband will return from his tech conference in Silicon Valley by the end of the week. Until then, you are not permitted to leave the east wing of the estate. The household staff has been explicitly instructed not to speak with you under any circumstances. Your meals will be delivered silently to your private suite." Eleanor was systematically stripping away Clara's entire support network, leaving her completely isolated in a vast sea of hostile silence. The psychological pressure was intentionally designed to break a person down within a matter of days. Clara retreated to her assigned suite, a massive room decorated in cold, impersonal shades of gray. She sat on the edge of the plush king-sized bed, listening to the heavy brass lock click into place from the outside corridor. She had no internet access, no way to contact the outside world, and no allies within 100 miles. The Vance family had successfully utilized their immense corporate wealth to create a total black hole, erasing her voice from existence without leaving a single physical bruise on her skin. However, Eleanor had made one catastrophic, irreversible miscalculation. She had locked a master architect inside a structurally complex building. Clara did not just see painted walls and decorative wooden moldings. She saw structural schematics, electrical conduits, and hidden ventilation grids. Pacing the perimeter of the room, Clara ran her sensitive fingers along the antique oak wainscoting. She easily recognized the specific retrofitting techniques used to install the modern internal security system. The cameras and electronic locks were wired through the primary central heating shafts, a common but deeply flawed residential integration method she had studied extensively during her university years. While Eleanor arrogantly believed she was domesticating a defeated animal, Clara was silently mapping the digital nervous system of the entire mansion. The power dynamic within the grand estate was already beginning to subtly shift beneath the surface. Clara knew that the estate relied on a dedicated Verizon Enterprise fiber optic line, but the internal routing system was highly vulnerable to localized physical manipulation. She needed a small, seemingly insignificant piece of metal to bridge a direct connection in the thermostat wiring. She needed to create a controlled short circuit that would blind the East Wing cameras for exactly 60 seconds, giving her just enough time to slip into her husband's private home office. That evening, when the silent maid brought in a silver tray containing a simple dinner, Clara carefully pocketed the heavy dining fork. She slipped the solid silver piece into her boot, her expression remaining entirely blank and defeated for the benefit of the ceiling cameras. It was a tiny, primitive tool, but in the steady hands of a desperate architectural engineer, it was the master key to dismantling a massive corporate empire. She sat by the reinforced glass window, watching the sleek luxury vehicles of the Vance corporate elite pull into the circular driveway for a lavish evening gala. They were drinking expensive wine, laughing, and aggressively celebrating the launch of the very sustainable harbor project they had ruthlessly stolen from her that morning. The sheer injustice of the scene below only fueled the cold, calculating rage burning inside her chest. Society often operates under the dangerous delusion that true evil requires a horrifying face, violent intentions, or a long criminal background. In reality, the most destructive forces in modern civilization wear perfectly tailored designer suits, sip vintage wine, and hide their malice behind impenetrable walls of corporate legality. True monstrousness does not hide in dark alleys waiting to strike. It sits at the head of mahogany boardroom tables, drafting ruthless contracts that legally consume the souls of the vulnerable. When power is entirely divorced from empathy, the legal system transforms from a protective shield into a perfectly sharpened weapon used exclusively by the wealthy to butcher the poor. The greatest tragedy of the modern era is not that justice is blind, but that it is incredibly expensive, and those who cannot afford the steep admission fee are simply ground into dust. Clara knew she could never win by playing their established rules. She had to destroy the entire board. The rhythmic thumping of heavy bass from the corporate gala downstairs violently shook the oak floorboards of the East Wing, providing the perfect acoustic cover for absolute sabotage. Clara knelt beside the digital thermostat near the heavy brass door of her designated prison suite. She waited until the grandfather clock in the distant hallway chimed midnight, signaling the exact moment the private security guards typically rotated their shifts. Her hands were completely steady as she wedged the stolen silver dining fork between the polished wall panel and the plastic casing of the temperature control unit. She did not hesitate. With a sharp, forceful twist, she snapped the internal casing, exposing the intricate web of red and blue wires that connected the localized heating system to the central security hub. Clara took a deep breath, mentally reviewing the electrical schematics she had memorized during her university years in Boston. She wedged the solid silver prong directly across the primary power conduit and the data transmission line. A sharp spark illuminated the dark room, followed immediately by the quiet, satisfying sound of a localized power surge. The glowing red light on the ceiling camera instantly blinked out, plunging the entire corridor into temporary blindness. The localized short circuit would confuse the main server for exactly 90 seconds before the backup generators forcefully rebooted the internal surveillance grid. It was an incredibly narrow window of opportunity, but desperation is the ultimate catalyst for absolute precision. She slipped out into the silent, heavily shadowed hallway, moving with the terrifying focus of a ghost haunting its own grave. Clara glided past the antique oil paintings and the velvet curtains, her bare feet making absolutely zero sound against the thick Persian rugs. Her target was situated at the far end of the corridor, the heavy mahogany door of her husband's private home office. David Vance was currently attending an elite tech summit in Silicon Valley, arrogantly assuming his brilliant, financially trapped wife was safely secured under his mother's ruthless supervision. He was tragically wrong. Clara reached the locked office door and stared at the biometric keypad. David was a man obsessed with cutting-edge security, but he was also a creature of extreme, arrogant habit. He always believed his intelligence was inherently superior to everyone around him. Clara bypassed the fingerprint scanner, flipped open the hidden mechanical panel, and entered the manual override code. It was the exact numerical date of their lavish wedding anniversary. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open instantly, a sickening reminder that the man who had promised to love and protect her was actively using the memory of their union to secure the very weapons he used to destroy her life. Stepping into the dark, leather-scented room, Clara immediately powered on his secondary desktop terminal. The glow of the massive curved monitor illuminated her cold, determined face. David had carelessly left his primary email client synchronized to the local network, entirely confident in the impenetrable fortress of the Vance estate. As Clara rapidly scrolled through the encrypted sent folder, the ultimate, horrifying truth of her reality finally materialized on the screen. Eleanor had not acted alone. In fact, Eleanor was merely the executioner. The true architect of Clara's total destruction was her own husband. She found a heavily encrypted email thread between David and a specialized legal firm based in Manhattan. The messages, dated several months prior, explicitly outlined a ruthless, calculated strategy to legally separate Clara from her sustainable harbor patents before the project went public. David had actively initiated the brutal corporate theft. He needed full, uncontested ownership of her billion-dollar eco-complex designs to secure his upcoming promotion to chief executive officer within the Vance empire. Even worse, Clara discovered a terrifying secondary document attached to a recent message. It was a fully drafted legal petition for involuntary psychiatric commitment. David was actively plotting to have her permanently institutionalized, citing severe mental instability and dangerous paranoia, ensuring she could never testify against the family or fight for her stolen intellectual property. A normal person would have shattered under the crushing weight of such profound, intimate betrayal. Clara merely stared at the screen, her heart turning into solid ice. She faced an agonizing, deeply controversial choice. She could easily wipe the hard drive, destroying his carefully curated evidence and causing immediate digital chaos, or she could forward the horrifying psychiatric petition to her father, begging him to hire cheap local press to expose the monster. Instead, Clara made a profoundly cold, strategic decision that would inevitably divide public opinion. She chose to leave the monstrous documents exactly where they were, allowing David to firmly believe his trap was still perfectly set. She would not warn her father, deliberately leaving the old man in the dark to maintain absolute operational security. She needed her enemies completely arrogant and entirely unbothered. Working with ruthless efficiency, Clara inserted a hidden command script into the desktop's root directory, creating a silent backdoor link directly to a secure, untraceable cloud server she had discreetly rented years ago. She was actively copying every single offshore bank routing number, every hidden crypto wallet phrase, and every illegally forged contract David had ever touched. She was not just stealing back her blueprints. She was systematically downloading the entire financial nervous system of the Vance family. Suddenly, the sharp, aggressive beep of the hallway security system resetting echoed through the heavy wooden door. The 90 seconds were completely gone. The cameras were actively rebooting, and the localized blackout was officially over. Clara rapidly shut down the terminal, plunging the office back into pitch darkness. As she turned toward the exit, the heavy brass doorknob of the office began to turn slowly from the outside. Heavy, unfamiliar footsteps paused right at the threshold. Clara backed into the deep shadows of the heavy velvet drapes, her breathing completely halted. She was no longer fighting for her intellectual property. She was fighting for her physical survival. The deepest wounds in human existence are rarely inflicted by absolute strangers lurking in the dark. They are meticulously carved by the people we actively invite into our homes, our beds, and our trusting hearts. Betrayal is not merely an act of sudden violence. It is a slow, methodical poison administered daily with a smiling face and a loving embrace. When intimacy is weaponized for financial gain, the victim is forced to mourn not only the stolen future, but the horrifying realization that the past was entirely synthetic. The greatest danger of trusting a monster is that in order to survive their cruelty, one must often learn to mimic their absolute ruthlessness. To tear down a kingdom built on deception, the innocent must permanently bury their own humanity and become the architect of a flawless nightmare. The heavy mahogany door swung violently open, slicing a sharp beam of harsh hallway light directly across the dark Persian rug. The lead security contractor stepped heavily into the private office, his thick hand resting aggressively on his holstered weapon. Clara pressed her spine flat against the freezing glass window, completely swallowed by the deep shadows of the heavy velvet drapes. She slowed her breathing to an absolute standstill, The massive man swept a tactical flashlight across the leather chairs, the tall bookshelves, and finally, the mahogany desk. He paused, stripping off his leather glove, and placed his bare palm flat against the back of the massive curved monitor. The hardware was still radiating a faint, unmistakable heat. The contractor's jaw tightened. He reached for his shoulder radio, but before he could press the transmission button, a chaotic burst of static erupted from the device. The main security hub violently ordered all available units to investigate a perimeter alarm triggered by a wandering animal near the south gate. The contractor grunted, turned on his heel, and marched out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Clara did not wait. She slipped out of the office, navigating the dark corridor with the silent precision of a hunting predator. She reached her designated prison suite and secured the brass lock just seconds before the digital thermostat rebooted and the ceiling cameras fully activated. She collapsed onto the mattress, staring at the dark ceiling. The backdoor script was officially buried deep inside her husband's corporate network. Every single offshore transaction he made was now silently cloning itself onto her hidden server. However, the Vance family did not build a massive real estate empire by being patient. The very next morning, the psychological warfare escalated to a terrifying new extreme. 2 silent guards escorted Clara downstairs into the grand dining room. Eleanor was seated at the head of the long table, sipping her morning espresso. Next to her sat a tall, sharp-featured man wearing an expensive gray suit. A thick medical file rested on the table directly in front of him. The terrifying psychiatric petition Clara had discovered on David's computer the night before was no longer just a digital threat. It was sitting physically in her own dining room. "This is a private specialist affiliated with a premier medical institution in Chicago," Eleanor stated, her voice dripping with artificial, heavily calculated sympathy. "Given your recent erratic behavior and your completely delusional claims about the Harbor Project patents, David and I have arranged an immediate psychological evaluation. We only want what is best for your fragile mental health." The specialist opened his notepad, staring at Clara with completely hollow, analytical eyes. He began asking incredibly invasive, legally loaded questions. He inquired about her sleep deprivation during the architectural drafting process, framing her extreme dedication as textbook manic behavior. He twisted her natural anger over the stolen patents into documented symptoms of aggressive paranoia. Clara realized the trap instantly. If she screamed, if she fought back, or if she desperately tried to prove her sanity to a man already paid to ignore it, she would give them the exact explosive reaction they needed. They would legally declare her an immediate danger to herself. The private ambulance was likely already idling in the estate driveway, fully prepared to drag her to a locked facility. The specialist slid a tiny paper cup across the polished mahogany table. Inside rested a single, heavy blue pill. It was a high-grade, highly regulated chemical sedative, a drug typically reserved for severely agitated hospital patients. "Take your medication, Clara," Eleanor commanded softly, a dangerous, triumphant gleam shining in her cold eyes. "Show us that you are willing to cooperate with your treatment, or we will be forced to take much more drastic legal measures for your own protection." Clara faced the most agonizing, inherently controversial decision of her entire existence. She could flip the table, refuse the powerful drug, and physically fight the guards, instantly triggering her absolute confinement in a psychiatric ward where she would permanently lose access to her cloud server. Alternatively, she could willingly poison her own central nervous system to maintain her physical presence inside the estate. Staring directly into Eleanor's dark, calculating eyes, Clara picked up the heavy blue sedative. She placed the chemical restraint on her tongue and swallowed it dry, never breaking eye contact. She deliberately sacrificed her own immediate cognitive clarity to secure her long-term vengeance. The powerful sedative flooded her bloodstream within 30 minutes. The sharp edges of the grand dining room began to violently blur, and her limbs grew terrifyingly heavy. The guards practically carried her back upstairs to her prison suite, dropping her onto the massive bed. Eleanor stood in the doorway, observing the artificial destruction of a brilliant mind with utter satisfaction. The matriarch closed the door, believing the war was entirely won. But deep inside Clara's chemically suppressed brain, a tiny, untouchable spark of absolute rage continued to burn. She knew the precise biological half-life of the medication. She would force herself to sleep through the daylight, preserving her remaining strength to wage digital warfare under the cover of midnight. The most terrifying prisons ever constructed by human hands do not rely on iron bars, concrete walls, or armed guards. They rely on the absolute weaponization of modern medicine. When clinical psychology is maliciously purchased by immense corporate wealth, the healer's pen becomes far more destructive than the executioner's blade. Society inherently trusts the clean white coat and the printed prescription, utterly blind to the horrifying reality that sanity is often defined exclusively by those who actively control the financial narrative. To chemically silence a brilliant mind is not merely an act of medical malpractice. It is a profound crime against the human spirit. Clara allowed them to temporarily chain her body to the mattress with heavy sedatives, entirely unaware that she had already unleashed a digital monster that would systematically consume their entire legacy from the inside out. The heavy chemical fog slowly lifted from her brain, leaving behind a piercing headache and pure, concentrated hatred. Clara forced her eyes open into the dark bedroom. The clock chimed 3 times, meaning she had lost 15 hours to the sedative. Her limbs felt like lead, but the burning adrenaline of survival pushed the poison out. She dragged herself across the carpet toward the massive flat-screen television on the far wall. The 85-inch luxury display was explicitly restricted to a closed internal entertainment network. However, corporate tech teams rarely accounted for the sheer ingenuity of a desperate architect. Clara knelt behind the sleek glass panel, expertly feeling for the recessed maintenance port. She used her stolen silver fork to gently pry off the protective casing, exposing the tiny manual reset button. Holding it down while pressing a specific sequence on the side panel, she successfully forced the operating system into a raw developer mode. The vibrant menu instantly vanished, replaced by a glaring white screen displaying lines of diagnostic code. Clara accessed the hidden, unfiltered web browser buried deep within the system architecture. She typed the incredibly complex web address of her encrypted cloud server entirely from memory. The screen flooded with thousands of highly classified documents. Her backdoor script had performed flawlessly. The digital anatomy of the Vance Empire was fully exposed right in her bedroom. Bypassing the standard ledgers, she immediately opened David's private, heavily encrypted offshore folders. What she discovered was infinitely worse than simple corporate greed. Her husband was not merely stealing her patents to secure a promotion. He was trying to save his own life. Clara uncovered a massive trail of illegal wire transfers routed through unregulated accounts in the Cayman Islands. David had secretly accumulated a staggering $50 million deficit in an underground investment syndicate dealing with violent international cartels. The scale of his financial ruin was breathtaking. David had systematically gambled away his personal trust fund and illegally leveraged the company's assets. But the final document made Clara's blood run absolutely cold. It was a promissory note extending his deadline with the ruthless syndicate. The document relied on the projected billion-dollar valuation of her stolen patents as guaranteed collateral. At the bottom of the page, resting next to David's signature, was a flawless forgery of her own handwriting, naming her as the primary legal guarantor of the underground debt. "He chained me to a sinking ship," Clara whispered to the empty room. The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the war. Eleanor and David were legally positioning her to take the fatal fall when the dangerous syndicate inevitably came to collect. If David failed to finalize the patent transfer, the cartels would hunt down the medically unstable wife who legally owed them $50 million. Clara faced a profoundly controversial moral crossroads. She had the syndicate's secure contact information right on the screen. She could wipe the forged document and attempt to flee. Or she could use her anonymous cloud email to send the syndicate absolute proof that David did not legally own the patents yet. By doing so, she would actively redirect an extremely violent criminal organization directly toward her own husband. She would cross a permanent line, evolving from a desperate victim into a ruthless predator actively orchestrating a potential murder. Staring at the glowing screen, Clara felt the last remnants of her compassionate identity shatter into dust. She opened a blank message window and attached the original, predated patent drafts. She typed a single, devastating sentence informing the syndicate that their $50 million collateral was fraudulent. She hit the send button without a single shred of hesitation. The message vanished into the dark web, instantly lighting a massive explosive fuse directly beneath David's arrogant feet. She had officially declared an invisible, merciless war. She quickly cleared the browsing history, exited the developer mode, and snapped the maintenance casing back into place. The screen faded to a blank black surface just seconds before the heavy brass lock on her bedroom door began to rattle. Clara dove silently back into the massive bed, pulling the duvet up and forcing her breathing into a slow pattern of drug-induced sleep. The door swung open, revealing the imposing silhouette of Eleanor Vance standing in the harsh hallway light. Eleanor stepped into the dark room, completely silent against the carpet. She stood over the bed, staring down at Clara's motionless body for a terrifying minute. Eleanor aggressively checked Clara's pulse to ensure the powerful sedative was still suppressing her nervous system. Clara remained perfectly still, enduring the repulsive touch. Satisfied that her captive was incapacitated, Eleanor whispered a sharp command to the waiting guard, instructing him to double the dosage of the blue pills for the morning meal. The absolute transformation of a human soul under immense, suffocating pressure is a terrifying phenomenon to witness. Society loves to romanticize the concept of pure, unyielding innocence, demanding that victims maintain their moral high ground even while they are being brutally slaughtered by the wealthy and the corrupt. But true survival in a hopelessly broken system rarely allows for the luxury of clean hands. When the law actively protects the architect of your destruction, morality becomes nothing more than a heavy, useless anchor dragging you down into the dark abyss. To completely dismantle a corrupt empire built on ruthless exploitation, the oppressed must eventually learn to speak the native language of the oppressor. They must embrace the cold, terrifying darkness and weaponize the very cruelty that was designed to break them. In the brutal mathematics of vengeance, absolute justice is never politely requested. It is ruthlessly extracted, drop by agonizing drop. The heavy, metallic scent of brewing espresso failed to mask the palpable tension radiating from the grand dining room the following morning. Clara sat stiffly in her chair, her eyes unfocused and her head drooping in a calculated display of drug-induced lethargy. She watched through half-closed lids as the maid placed a small porcelain ramekin on the table. Inside sat 2 heavy blue pills, the double dosage Eleanor had ordered. Clara felt a cold shiver of pure adrenaline, but her facial muscles remained entirely slack. As the maid turned to retrieve the silver water pitcher, Clara executed a practiced sleight of hand she had perfected in her dark room. She slid the sedatives into the hidden lining of her heavy wool cardigan, replacing them with 2 identical-looking chalk mints she had salvaged from a decorative bowl in the hallway. She swallowed the mints with a dramatic, labored gulp, allowing a small trickle of water to run down her chin. Eleanor watched from the head of the table, her expression one of bored, aristocratic triumph. The matriarch was interrupted by the frantic vibrating of a secure encrypted phone on the mahogany surface. Eleanor frowned, noting the international country code on the caller ID. She stood up abruptly and paced toward the grand floor-to-ceiling windows. "I told you the final patent transfer would be completed by Friday," Eleanor hissed into the phone, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. She was clearly unaware that Clara's hearing had become hypersensitive in the absence of the actual medication. "The collateral is solid. My son is currently in California finalizing the board's approval." There was a long, terrifying silence as the person on the other end spoke. Eleanor's face visibly drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. Her hand began to tremble, nearly dropping the expensive device. "What do you mean? Fraudulent? That is impossible. We have the original drafts." The invisible bomb Clara had detonated from the smart television was now ripping through the Vance estate. The underground syndicate had clearly received her anonymous evidence and was now actively threatening Eleanor's life. The older woman turned toward Clara, her eyes narrowing with a sudden, sharp suspicion. She marched back to the table, leaning down until her face was inches from Clara's. "Did you do something?" she demanded, her breath smelling of bitter coffee and expensive cigarettes. "Did you contact someone before we took your devices?" Clara maintained her mask of chemical vacancy, allowing her head to LOL uselessly to the side. She let a single, meaningless string of gibberish escape her lips, mimicking the behavior of a person whose cognitive functions were melting under heavy sedation. Eleanor let out a frustrated growl and shoved Clara's shoulder, nearly knocking her out of the chair. The matriarch was unraveling. The professional predator was finally realizing she was trapped in a cage of her son's making. Eleanor grabbed her silk wrap and signaled for the lead security contractor. "Double the perimeter guards. No one enters or leaves this estate without my personal biometric authorization." And find my son. I don't care if he's in a board meeting or on a private jet, get David on a secure line immediately." As Eleanor stormed out of the room to handle the impending disaster, the lead contractor lingered for a moment, staring at Clara with a look of predatory curiosity. He walked toward her, his heavy boots thudding against the marble. "You're a very good actress, Mrs. Vance," the man whispered, his voice dangerously low. He leaned over the table, picking up the empty water glass. He turned it slowly in his gloved hand, his eyes scanning Clara's perfectly still form. "But I've spent 20 years guarding high-value prisoners in federal black sites. I know what a sedated person looks like, and I know what a hunting animal looks like. You aren't sleeping. You're waiting." Clara felt her heart stop for a fraction of a second, but she did not blink. She did not twitch. She remained a statue of broken glass. The contractor let out a short, dry laugh, and set the glass back down with a sharp click. "Don't worry. I'm not paid to protect your mother-in-law's soul. I'm paid to keep this estate secure. And right now, the biggest threat to this estate isn't outside the gates. It's currently sitting in David's office in Silicon Valley, lying to people who skin debtors alive for fun." He leaned in closer, his breath cold against her ear. "If you survive the next 48 hours, remember that I was the one who didn't tell her about the mints." The contractor turned and walked away, leaving Clara alone in the suffocating silence of the dining room. The stakes had officially shifted from corporate espionage to a desperate race for physical survival. Her husband had lied to a violent international cartel. Her mother-in-law was losing control of the narrative, and a mercenary guard now held the secret of her fake sedation like a knife to her throat. Every pillar of the Vance empire was beginning to crack under the weight of their own arrogance. In the ruthless upper echelons of modern society, loyalty is never a permanent bond. It is merely a temporary financial arrangement that expires the moment a higher bidder appears, or the risk becomes too great. When a kingdom is built on the systematic exploitation of others, the very walls are constructed from betrayal and greed, making the entire structure fundamentally unstable. The greatest weakness of the elite is their unshakable belief that everyone beneath them is a mindless tool to be used and discarded. They fail to realize that a tool, when sharpened by absolute desperation and tempered by pure hatred, can easily become a weapon capable of severing the head of the master. Clara knew that the chaos she had unleashed was only the beginning. To win a war against monsters, one must not only survive the darkness but learn to command the very demons that haunt the shadows. Justice was no longer her primary goal. Total, irreversible annihilation was the only path forward. The heavy, rhythmic thrumming of a private helicopter landing on the estate's limestone pad late that night signaled the arrival of David Vance. Clara sat in the darkness of her suite, her eyes sharp and her mind calculating every possible outcome. She had spent the last several hours monitoring her cloud server via the smart television's hidden browser. The data migration was complete. She now possessed every offshore account number, every fraudulent wire transfer, and the exact coordinates of the digital vault David had used to launder money for the international syndicate. She was no longer just an architect of buildings. She was the architect of their total financial liquidation. David practically kicked the door to her suite open, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face a mask of sweating, unadulterated panic. He didn't even look at Clara's face to see if she was sedated. He lunged for his private laptop, which Eleanor had returned to his desk earlier that evening. "Where is it?" he hissed, his fingers flying across the keyboard with frantic, uncoordinated movements. "The syndicate just sent me a video of a man being dissolved in acid. They said someone leaked the original patent drafts. They know I'm lying, Clara." He turned to her, his eyes bulging with a terrifying mixture of guilt and predatory rage. Clara maintained her position on the bed, her expression remaining perfectly blank as she allowed her head to tilt slowly to the side. She was performing the role of a drugged captive for the benefit of the ceiling cameras, even as her heart beat with a cold, triumphant rhythm. David grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "Did you do it? Did you find a way to talk to them? Answer me." He was no longer the arrogant Silicon Valley executive. He was a cornered rat realizing the walls of his own maze were closing in. Eleanor stepped into the room, her presence as cold and sharp as a winter blade. She watched her son's breakdown with a look of profound disgust. "Stop shaking her, David. She's been under a double dosage for over 24 hours. She can't even remember her own name, let alone contact an international criminal organization. Eleanor walked toward the desk, her silk gown trailing behind her like a shroud. The leak didn't come from inside this room. It came from your own sloppy security. You brought a violent cartel to my doorstep, David. You gambled my empire on a lie you couldn't sustain. The betrayal between mother and son was now visible in every sharp word and every hateful glance. David let go of Clara, stumbling back toward the window. I did it for the company. I needed that promotion to fix the deficit before you found out. If we don't give them the final patent rights by dawn, they're coming here, Mother. They don't care about your real estate empire. They care about the $50 million I promised them. Eleanor stared at her son, her silence more terrifying than any scream. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. I've spent the last 6 hours negotiating with their primary auditor. I've agreed to transfer the Harbor Project assets directly to their shell company in exchange for your life. But in return, David, you are officially removed from the board. You will sign the confession for the corporate espionage yourself. You will take the fall for everything. Or I will hand you to them personally. Clara watched the two monsters tear each other apart, her internal satisfaction reaching a fever pitch. They were so blinded by their own survival instincts that they failed to notice the tiny, blue light blinking on David's secondary terminal. The backdoor script she had installed was actively broadcasting their entire conversation to her remote server, recorded in high-definition audio and video. She had just captured a mother and son negotiating a multi-million-dollar criminal payoff and a confession of corporate fraud. David collapsed into the desk chair, his head in his hands. The weight of his mother's ultimatum crushed what was left of his pride. Fine, he whispered, his voice broken and hollow. I'll sign it. Just get them off my back. Just make sure they don't come for me. He grabbed a pen and began signing the stack of legal documents Eleanor had prepared. He was signing away his career, his reputation, and his freedom to save his own skin from the cartel's wrath. Eleanor grabbed the signed papers, a look of cold, predatory relief washing over her face. She didn't look back at her son, and she didn't look at Clara. She walked out of the room to finalize the illegal transaction, leaving David alone in the dark. He stood up slowly, walked over to Clara, and stared down at her with a look of pure, concentrated malice. He reached out and touched her cheek, his hand trembling with repressed violence. I should have left you in that attic in Boston, he whispered, his voice a jagged edge of regret. You were always too smart for your own good. But don't worry, Clara. Once this is over, the psychiatric facility is still waiting. I'll make sure you never have a clear thought again. The most profound tragedy of human nature is the absolute ease with which love can be converted into a calculated instrument of destruction. When a relationship is built on the shifting sands of ego and financial gain, the foundation is inherently destined to collapse under the weight of the first major crisis. True evil is not found in the grand gestures of villainy, but in the quiet, intimate betrayals shared between family members behind closed doors. To survive a world where the people meant to protect you are the ones holding the knife, one must be willing to burn every bridge and sever every emotional tie. Clara watched her husband walk out of the room, entirely unaware that the fire she had started was already consuming the air in his lungs. She was no longer a wife, a daughter-in-law, or a victim. She was the final judge, and the sentence she had prepared for the Vance family would be far more permanent than any prison. The heavy, oppressive silence of the East Wing was shattered at 4 o'clock in the morning by the distant, aggressive barking of the estate's Dobermans. Clara sat upright in the darkness, her eyes burning with a cold, predatory clarity. She had spent the last 2 hours using the smart television's maintenance mode to initiate the final sequence of her counteroffensive. Every single recorded conversation, every forged bank document, and the high-definition video of Eleanor and David's criminal negotiation was currently being uploaded to the private server of a lead investigative journalist at the Chicago Tribune and a specialized task force at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She stood up, her limbs still feeling a faint, ghostly numbness from the chemical restraints, but her resolve was a solid slab of granite. She reached into the hidden lining of her cardigan and retrieved the 2 heavy blue sedatives she had swapped for mints earlier. She didn't throw them away. Instead, she walked toward the small silver tray containing David's unfinished glass of expensive scotch, left on the nightstand during his earlier panic. Clara crushed the potent pills into a fine powder using the base of a heavy crystal lamp and stirred the chemical poison into the amber liquid. It was a poetic, cold-blooded reversal of the weapon they had used to silence her. Just as she finished, the door handle rattled with frantic urgency. David stumbled back into the room, his face drained of all blood. "The syndicate is at the south gate, Clara," he gasped, his voice a ragged whisper of absolute terror. "Mother is at the main terminal trying to finalize the wire transfer. But the bank's security flagged the Cayman accounts. They think it's money laundering." He lunged for the scotch, his hands trembling so violently that the glass rattled against his teeth. He drained the poisoned liquid in a single, desperate gulp, seeking any form of chemical courage to face the monsters at his door. Clara watched him with a look of terrifying, silent detachment. "It's not just flagged, David," she said, her voice finally breaking its long, forced silence. The sound was as sharp and cold as a razor blade. David froze, the empty glass slipping from his hand and shattering against the hardwood floor. He stared at her, his pupils dilating as the double dosage of high-grade sedative began to hit his system with the force of a high-speed train. "I'm the one who flagged the accounts. I'm the one who sent the original blueprints to the syndicate. And I'm the one who just sent your signed confession to the federal authorities." The realization hit David just as his motor functions began to fail. He tried to lunge toward her, to wrap his hands around her throat, but his legs folded beneath him like wet paper. He collapsed onto the rug at her feet, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. You ruined everything," he managed to choke out, his eyes rolling back into his head. Clara knelt beside him, her face inches from his. "No, David. I simply returned the masterpiece you tried to build. You wanted a wife who was a silent asset. Now, you have a wife who is your primary witness." Suddenly, the heavy sound of a physical breach echoed from the floor below. The syndicate's enforcers had grown tired of waiting for the digital transfer. The sound of shattering glass and the muffled pops of silenced weapons signaled the end of the Vance family's private security. Clara didn't panic. She had already calculated the exact response time of the Chicago Police Department based on the silent alarm she had triggered through the mansion's hijacked security grid 3 minutes ago. She slipped out of the room, leaving her husband unconscious on the floor. She navigated the service corridors she had mapped during her first night of incarceration. She reached the heavy reinforced door of the estate's main security hub. Inside, Eleanor was screaming at a terrified IT technician, her hands clawing at the monitor screens as she watched her offshore balances drop to zero. Clara had initiated a scorched earth script that was currently rerouting every cent of the Vance family's liquid assets into an untraceable legal defense fund for the victims of their previous real estate scams. "The gates are open, Eleanor," Clara said, standing in the doorway with her arms folded. The matriarch spun around, her face a mask of aristocratic horror. She looked at the monitors, then at Clara, then at the heavy security doors that were now sliding open due to the system override. The distant sirens of the federal task force were already wailing in the driveway, clashing with the dark SUVs of the syndicate enforcers. The Vance empire was being squeezed between the hammer of the law and the anvil of the underworld. True power is not a permanent shield. It is a temporary illusion maintained by the silence and fear of those beneath you. When that silence is broken and that fear is converted into calculated, systematic retribution, the walls of the fortress become nothing more than a vertical graveyard. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one with the most money or the most weapons, but the one who has already lost everything and has absolutely nothing left to fear. Society teaches the vulnerable to pray for mercy, but true justice is never found in a prayer. It is found in the meticulous destruction of the oppressor's foundation. Clara walked toward the secret exit behind the library, leaving the monsters to face the chaos they had invited into their own home. She was no longer a captive waiting for a savior. She was the storm that had finally arrived to wash the blood from the marble. The cold, pre-dawn air of Chicago bit into Clara's skin as she stepped through the hidden library exit, moving away from the mansion that had become her temporary tomb. Behind her, the Vance estate had transformed into a chaotic battlefield of flashing blue lights and the dark, menacing silhouettes of the syndicate's armored vehicles. The sounds of heavy tactical boots and the sharp, staccato orders of the FBI task force filled the air, effectively drowning out Eleanor's hysterical screams. Clara didn't look back. She walked toward a nondescript silver sedan parked 3 blocks away. a vehicle she had arranged through an untraceable encrypted app hours earlier. As the car pulled away from the affluent suburbs, Clara opened her laptop and initiated the final, public stage of her liberation. She watched in real time as the Chicago Tribune's digital front page erupted with the evidence she had provided. The headline was a masterpiece of investigative destruction. Vance's real estate empire built on stolen dreams and cartel cash. The story included the video of Eleanor and David's criminal negotiation, the forged bank documents, and a detailed map of their offshore accounts. Within minutes, the story was picked up by national news networks, effectively incinerating the family's reputation before the sun had even fully risen over the skyline. Back at the estate, the scene was one of absolute, irreversible ruin. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had spent 40 years cultivating an image of untouchable aristocratic grace, was dragged out of the front doors in handcuffs. Her expensive silk gown was torn, and her hair was a tangled mess of silver and ash. She was forced to walk past a sea of cameras, her face finally exposed to the world as the cold-blooded predator she had always been. The FBI seized every server, every physical file, and every luxury asset tied to the Vance name. The corporate headquarters in the city were simultaneously raided, bringing the entire multi-billion-dollar operation to a violent, grinding halt. David's fate was even more pathetic. Because of the heavy sedative Clara had stirred into his scotch, he was found unconscious and unresponsive on the floor of his office. He was transported to the hospital under heavy federal guard, only to wake up 3 hours later to a world that had completely erased him. He was no longer a powerful executive. He was a federal inmate facing 30 years in prison for corporate espionage, money laundering, and fraud. Even more terrifying for him was the realization that the syndicate enforcers had been arrested in his driveway. They had seen his face, and they knew he had tried to swindle them. Even behind bars, David Vance would never be safe again. Clara watched the live news feed from a quiet, 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. She saw her own father's house being guarded by a private security firm she had hired using the last of the Vance's untraceable crypto funds. He was safe. His mortgage was paid in full, and the legal documents proving the debt was fraudulent were already on their way to his attorney. The shadow of the Vance family had finally been lifted from his life. Clara felt a single, cold tear roll down her cheek, not out of sadness but out of the sheer, exhausting relief of absolute victory. The legal fallout was a massive, uncontrolled explosion that triggered a chain reaction throughout the city's financial sector. The Harbor Project, the sustainable masterpiece Clara had spent years of her life designing, was immediately frozen by the courts. However, because she had provided the original, predated drafts and the digital breadcrumbs of the theft, her legal ownership was being fast-tracked for restoration. The very project they had tried to steal from her would now become the primary engine of her new, independent career. She was no longer the girl from the attic. She was the architect who had brought down a dynasty. As the morning light finally touched the skyscrapers of Chicago, the Vance name began to vanish from the signs and the ledgers of the city. The board of directors issued a formal statement of total dissociation, and the family's remaining supporters fled like rats from a burning ship. The mansion itself was scheduled for immediate seizure and auction to pay for the massive legal fines and the restitution fund Clara had created. The fortress of luxury had become a hollow shell of glass and stone, a monument to the absolute arrogance of the wealthy. Clara closed her laptop and walked out into the crisp morning light. She had no home, no husband, and no corporate title. She had nothing but her brilliant mind and her absolute freedom. She looked up at the towering buildings, the structures of power and steel that defined the modern world. For the first time in her life, she didn't see them as impenetrable obstacles. She saw them as collections of structural weaknesses waiting to be exploited. She had survived the darkest nightmare the Vance family could orchestrate, and she had emerged as something far more dangerous than a victim. The ultimate destruction of a corrupt institution is rarely a clean or quiet process. It is a violent, necessary upheaval that exposes the rot hidden beneath the polished surface. Society often mistakes financial stability for moral authority, allowing those with the most wealth to dictate the definitions of truth and justice. But when the foundation of an empire is built on the bones of the exploited and the blood of the betrayed, it is destined to eventually collapse under its own unsustainable weight. True justice is not a gift granted by the legal system. It is a fierce, uncompromising force of nature that demands absolute accountability for every act of cruelty. To rebuild a life from the ashes of a calculated betrayal, one must first be willing to let the old world burn completely to the ground. Clara stood on the sidewalk, a silent architect in a city that didn't yet know her name, watching the sun rise over a horizon that finally belonged to her. 1 year after the spectacular collapse of the Vance Empire, the Chicago skyline witnessed the official groundbreaking ceremony for the Sustainable Harbor Project. Clara Hayes stood at the center of the podium, the wind from Lake Michigan whipping through her dark hair. She was no longer wearing the heavy designer jewelry of a Vance bride. She wore the simple, sharp suit of a chief executive officer. Behind her, the massive steel cranes began to move, finally bringing her original vision to life under the banner of her own independent firm. The news cameras that had once captured her being escorted in silence were now broadcast to millions, celebrating the woman who had transformed a corporate nightmare into a monumental success for the city. The legal justice had been as absolute as Clara's blueprints. Eleanor Vance was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal correctional facility, stripped of every luxury she had once used as a weapon. Her days were no longer filled with silk scarves and mahogany boardrooms, but with the cold, gray reality of a prison cell. David Vance, facing the combined wrath of the federal government and the international syndicate, had been sentenced to 35 years. He was legally prohibited from ever holding a corporate position again, and his name had been scrubbed from every architectural record in the country. They were not just imprisoned, they were professionally and socially erased. Clara had used the remnants of the Vance Restitution Fund to build more than just buildings. She established a national legal foundation dedicated to protecting young innovators from predatory corporate contracts. She became a silent guardian for those who, like her, had been underestimated because of their humble origins. Her father sat in the front row of the ceremony, his face glowing with a pride that no amount of money could ever purchase. He was no longer a man under the shadow of debt. He was the father of the most influential architect in the Midwest. As the ceremony concluded, Clara walked toward the edge of the pier, looking out at the vast, shimmering water. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver dining fork, the original tool of her liberation. She stared at it for a long moment, remembering the cold floors of the East Wing and the suffocating taste of the blue sedatives. With a steady hand, she tossed the piece of metal into the deep blue depths of the lake. It was the final tether to her past, sinking into the dark water where it could never hurt anyone again. The Vance mansion, once a fortress of arrogance, had been purchased by the city and converted into a public library and community center. The high-security cameras were replaced with reading lights, and the locked corridors were now filled with the laughter of children. Clara had personally overseen the redesign, ensuring that the space was open, transparent, and accessible to everyone. She had taken a monument of exclusion and turned it into a sanctuary of knowledge. The empire of glass and stone had been dismantled, and in its place, something far more durable had been built. Clara's phone buzzed with a notification from her lead engineer, but she didn't answer it immediately. She allowed herself a few more minutes of silence to appreciate the horizon. She had lost her marriage, her safety, and her peace of mind to win this war. But in the process, she had found a version of herself that was unbreakable. She was no longer defined by the people who tried to steal her light. She was defined by the towers she built and the lives she protected. The scars remained, but they were now the foundation of her strength. The true measure of a person's character is not found in how they handle their success, but in how they maintain their humanity while enduring the most brutal forms of betrayal. In a world that often rewards the ruthless and the greedy, the act of remaining kind and principled is the ultimate form of rebellion. Society may try to convince us that power requires the sacrifice of our souls, but true authority comes from the ability to rise above the darkness without becoming part of it. When we are pushed to our absolute limits by those who wish to see us fail, we are given a choice: to become the monster that hunted us, or to become the light that exposes them. Justice is not merely the punishment of the wicked. It is the restoration of the innocent and the commitment to building a future where such cruelty can no longer survive. The most satisfying revenge is not the destruction of your enemies, but the creation of a life so brilliant and so meaningful that their existence becomes an irrelevant footnote in your story. To heal from a profound injustice, one must eventually trade the sword of vengeance for the pen of creation. Clara looked at the rising structure of her harbor project, a testament to the fact that even the most carefully constructed traps can be dismantled by a mind that refuses to be caged. The architecture of her new life was flawless, built on the solid ground of truth, resilience, and the quiet, enduring power of the human spirit.